Imagine standing in the sun-bleached ruins of a lost capital, staring not at a golden throne or a rusted blade, but at a single charred bowl of porridge, because in the Hittite Empire, this humble meal wasn't food, it was a weapon. If you walk through Hattusa today, the stones don't read like a palace, they read like an evidence locker. Between the jagged limestone crags of Anatolia lie ash-filled kitchens and broken clay tablets, forensic markers of a system that fed its gods by draining the lifeblood of its people. Inside this one bowl, we find the DNA of an empire, cracked barley, rendered mutton fat, and a calculated trace of honey. To a tired laborer, this was dinner. To an archaeologist, it is a balance sheet. Every kernel was taxed. Every calorie was recorded in cuneiform. Every pot was boiled to sustain a god-king who ruled through the stomach of his subjects. This wasn't just a recipe. It was a mechanism of absolute extraction. We are looking at a society where hunger was a policy, and a full belly was a privilege granted by the state. We're going to peel back the layers of this ancient stew to see how a civilization turned grain into gravity, holding a fractured world together through the sheer force of a meal. Today, we are analyzing this historical menu as an autopsy of power. To understand the Hittite table, you have to stop thinking about chefs and start thinking about bureaucrats. In the capital of Hattusa, the kitchen was an extension of the treasury. When we look at the surviving cuneiform tablets, specifically the temple supply records, we aren't looking at a cookbook, we're looking at a ledger of mandatory sacrifice. The Hittites lived in a world of spiritual debt. The gods were the ultimate landowners, and the king was their head bailiff. If the gods weren't fed, the rain stopped, the iron rusted, and the empire fell. This created a rigid, top-down calories as tax system. At the base of this pyramid was the Lu-Mes Apila, the plowmen. These weren't independent farmers. They were often semi-free laborers bound to the land, tilling the thin, rocky soil of the Anatolian plateau. As historian Trevor Bryce notes, the Hittite state was obsessively organized. Every village had a quota. A portion of their harvest was immediately siphoned off to local silos, then funneled toward the great temple complexes. Inside the temple walls, the social autopsy becomes even more clinical. There was a profound obsession with purity, upesar. The people preparing this grain stew weren't just cooks, they were high-status ritual agents who could be executed for the slightest contamination. If a hair or a pebble was found in the king's or a god's bowl, it wasn't a culinary mistake, it was a capital offense against the cosmic order. This purity served a dual purpose. It made the food holy, but it also signaled a terrifying level of control over the human body. If a baker gives the king a loaf of bread that is unclean, he and his family shall be put to death. This wasn't hyperbole, it was the sage logic of the Bronze Age. The more refined the grain, the more absolute the power. While the commoner ate a coarse, gritty mash of emmer and wild greens, the elite consumed grain that had been winnowed and sifted until it was as smooth as silk. They ate the fat of the land. Literally. Rendered mutton fat, udu, wasn't just for flavor, it was a luxury calorie source, a dense white energy that separated the rulers from the ruled. The social context of this stew reveals a labor hierarchy that is almost suffocating. To produce one bowl of pure temple stew required the labor of dozens, the farmer to grow it, the porter to transport it, the temple official to weigh it, the woman to grind it on a stone saddle quern for hours until her joints ached, and the priest to bless it. This meal didn't just satisfy hunger, it reaffirmed with every bite that some were born to provide and others were born to consume. It was a caloric demonstration of who owned the sun and the soil. To recreate this meal is to enter a world of friction. Modern cooking is about convenience. Hittite cooking was about resistance. I started with a bag of raw emmer wheat, not the pearled, easy-to-boil grains you find in a health food store, but a stubborn, hulled ancestor of wheat that refuses to yield. As a relatable explorer, my first instinct was to reach for a food processor. But to understand the autopsy of power, you have to feel the labor. I spent 3 hours over a stone quern, a flat basalt slab, pushing a smaller hand stone back and forth. Within 20 minutes, the sage in me realized why ancient skeletons from Hattusa show such specific pathology. The women's vertebrae are often fused, their toes curled from bracing against the floor. Every tablespoon of flour in this stew represents an hour of human life traded for texture. The finer the grain, the more life was spent. This wasn't just cooking, it was a physical tax. Once the grain was cracked, not ground into a fine powder, but broken into gritty, irregular fragments, the process shifted from labor to patience. I heated a heavy ceramic pot, mimicking the subterranean ovens of the temple kitchens. In the Bronze Age, heat was a precious resource, managed by specialists who understood the temperament of wood and dung fires. I added the rendered mutton fat first. In our world, we trim the fat. In theirs, they worshipped it. As it melted, the smell was heavy, primal, and slightly barnyard, a sensory reminder that this was a meal of the animal and the earth. I then added the cracked emmer, stirring it until every grain was coated in that translucent gold. This is the moment where the social autopsy becomes tangible. Without constant stirring, the grain sticks and burns. This stew demands your undivided attention. It requires a servant to stand by the hearth, inhaling the smoke, focused entirely on the pot. Next came the aromatics. Based on archaeobotanical finds, I used wild leeks and a touch of coriander. No salt. Salt was often a state-controlled luxury, used sparingly. Instead, I added a small amount of honey. This is the sage moment. The Hittites loved the juxtaposition of savory fat and sweet nectar. It wasn't about tasty in the modern sense. It was about the ritual of preciousness. You are eating things that took months to grow and miles to travel. As the water hit the hot grains, a thick, starchy cloud rose. For the next 2 hours, the stew simmered. It didn't behave like rice or pasta. It stayed tough, resilient, expanding slowly into a dense porridge-like consistency that looks deceptively simple. But as I tasted it throughout the process, I felt the judgment calls of the ancient cook. If you add too much water, it's a soup, the food of the poor. If you don't stir enough, it's ruined, and in a temple, that could be a death sentence. The final result is a heavy golden gray mash that looks like wet concrete, but smells like a forest floor and a butcher's shop. It is incredibly dense. A few spoonfuls feel like a brick in your stomach. It makes you realize that for a Hittite official, this wasn't just a meal, it was a biological battery. It provided the slow-release energy needed to oversee a construction site or march a chariot division through the Taurus Mountains. The physical difficulty of sourcing these ingredients and the sheer bodily exhaustion of preparing them by hand confirms the thesis. Only an elite, supported by a massive, invisible labor force, could afford to eat something so simple. This stew is the result of 1,000 hours of grinding, hauling, and stirring. It is the taste of a system that has perfected the art of making the many work for the few. As I take the final bite of this dense, honey-glazed grain, the autopsy is complete. The evidence is undeniable. What began as a simple bowl of porridge has revealed itself to be a sophisticated piece of imperial technology. We've seen how the grain was extracted as a spiritual tax, how the labor was ground into the flour by broken bodies, and how the purity of the hearth was guarded by the threat of death. This stew confirms that the Hittite Empire was not held together merely by iron swords or chariot wheels. It was held together by a caloric ritual. By controlling the grain, the great king controlled time, labor, and the very survival of his subjects. The taste itself, heavy, sweet, and uncompromising, is the taste of permanence. It is a meal designed to endure, much like the stones of Hattusa themselves. In this series, we don't just look at the past, we dissect it. We've reconstructed the VIP menu of a forgotten superpower, and in doing so, we've found that power isn't always found in a decree. Sometimes it's hidden in the bottom of a bowl. We don't just cook ancient food, we decode the civilizations behind them.